The men who broke Rome's last capital inherited a problem no cannon could solve. How to make conquered cities, sea roads, and soldiers answer to one rule. On that frontier, the early Ottomans did not merely raid. They learned to govern, to count grain, bind fighters to service, and make conquest answer to law, prayer, and pay. By the 16th century, Ottoman power passed hand to hand. Cargo became duty orders, became rations, grain, coin, and command had to arrive together. But what happened when command arrived first? Long before 1922, the fracture had a smaller shape. An open telegram, a pen stopped over unpaid figures. Men waiting beyond a gate, orders still moved. Wages did not.
Frontier household that could barely command villages along the Bithynian frontier would one day rule from Constantinople over Cairo, Damascus, and the Hijaz. That was the Ottoman paradox. It began with grazing land, timbered hills, rough tracks, and old Byzantine towns whose walls still stood, even when the authority behind them had grown thin. Northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century was a broken political borderland. Seljuk authority had weakened. Mongol pressure disturbed the interior. Turkmen groups moved with herds, families, saints, and armed retainers. Across the frontier stood Byzantine fortresses, villages, monasteries, and fields. It was a place where loyalty could be negotiated, raiding could become service, and local survival often mattered more than distant imperial claims. Osman, the figure later remembered as founder, ruled one of several Anatolian beyliks. His early career is partly obscured by later legend, but the outline is clear enough. His followers pushed into Byzantine territory and gathered men who wanted land, plunder, protection, or advancement. Faith mattered. So did food, horses, pasture, and the chance to belong to a rising household. An early victory near Bayphius in 1302 helped give the small Ottoman following a wider name on the frontier. We cannot know every rumor that followed it, but success drew attention. A warrior might ride towards Osman's camp because other men had already done so. A village elder might negotiate because older protection had failed. By Orhan's reign, that frontier name was attached to towns and tax. The Ottomans were not born as a grand imperial machine. They learned by taking and holding. A captured village needed tax agreements. A fortified town needed guards. Christian peasants might stay if their harvests were protected. Muslim settlers needed legal order. Dervishes and preachers gave the frontier a moral language, while commanders watched the grain sacks and counted the animals. Under Orhan, that frontier lordship became harder to dismiss. Bursa fell in 1326 and gave the dynasty an urban center of real value. Its workshops, markets, baths, and silk trade changed the scale of Ottoman power. A ruler who held Bursa could pay men, host scholars, endow buildings, and speak from a city rather than a camp. Bursa also taught the Ottomans how to inhabit older worlds. Byzantine churches, walls, and streets did not simply vanish. Some were repurposed. Others remained in use under new arrangements. Traders still needed safe routes. Artisans still needed buyers. The new ruler needed the city awake at dawn because revenue came from people who kept working. The crossing into Europe widened the horizon. In the 1350s, Ottoman forces gained a foothold at Gallipoli, near the narrow waters between Asia and Europe. From there, movement into Thrace became easier. Armies, settlers, captives, merchants, and messengers crossed the straits. The Beylik now stood in two continents, and its ambitions had found a new road. Murad I pushed this European presence into a durable political order. Victories near the Maritsa and at Kosovo did not end resistance, but they marked the Ottomans as a Balkan power. Fortresses changed hands. Tribute arrangements appeared. Roads once guarded by local lords now carried Ottoman officials and soldiers. In many districts, rule first arrived as tax, garrison, and oath. Edirne, the former Adrianople, became a capital of campaigning and administration. Its position mattered. Roads led from it towards the Balkans, the Danube, and Constantinople itself. In its markets, Balkan produce and Anatolian power met under Ottoman supervision. The empire was still young. From Edirne, it could look west and south at the same time. Expansion in the Balkans was no march over empty ground. Serbian, Bulgarian, Byzantine, Albanian, and other powers negotiated, resisted, allied, and fractured. Some local elites entered Ottoman service, others fought and lost. Villagers met the new order through judges, levies, registers, and the presence of armed men near roads and bridges. The dynasty also had to discipline its own success. Mounted warriors expected reward. Palace servants needed training. Judges needed recognized authority. Revenue had to be recorded before it could be spent. The Ottoman answer was practical before it was elegant. Write down land, assign income, bind service, and keep enough force close to the ruler. Then came a warning that empire could still break. In 1402, Timur defeated Bayezid near Ankara, and the Ottoman domains fell into civil conflict. Sons of the dynasty fought for years. Provincial loyalties shifted. Some Christian vassals and Muslim beys watched carefully for advantage. After Ankara, rival claimants and their allies chose sides across the old domains. The recovery after Ankara mattered almost as much as the earlier rise. The Ottoman house reassembled its lands, rebuilt authority, and returned to the work of conquest. That survival showed that the dynasty had already put down administrative roots. It could lose a battle and still find men to collect revenue, hold cities, repair alliances, and claim obedience in the old name. Constantinople remained the prize that gave this movement a sharper meaning. The city had already been taken by Crusaders in 102–004 and later restored to Byzantine rule. By the 15th century it was diminished, but not emptied of significance. Its walls still guarded the Bosporus. Its churches, palaces, cisterns, and ceremonies carried the memory of Rome in the east. In 1453, Mehmed II did what earlier Ottoman and Muslim sieges had failed to do. He took Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire as a state. Before the siege, he tightened the Bosporus with a new fortress. During it, cannon battered the land walls and ships pressed the city from different sides. After it, the old imperial capital had to be made useful again. Mehmed did not want a deserted prize. He set about refilling and reorganizing the city. People were brought or encouraged to settle there. Hagia Sophia became an imperial mosque. Markets, workshops, courts, and neighborhoods were restored under Ottoman rule in everyday Ottoman Turkish. Istanbul became widely used, while Constantini and older names endured in documents, formal usage, and foreign speech. The new capital gave the dynasty an older stage. The Sultan could stand in a Roman city, command a Muslim dynasty, and rule Christian, Jewish, and Muslim subjects from a palace above the meeting of seas. Communal arrangements evolved over time and varied by place and century. Religious leaders and local authorities managed many internal affairs within imperial limits. The problem was plain enough. How could a frontier dynasty turn conquered diversity into usable power? Mehmed's answer lay in resettlement, courts, taxation, hierarchy, and careful patronage. A Greek patriarch might secure a community's place. A Jewish trader might help revive commerce. A Turkish soldier might guard a gate. Each had a different path into the imperial order. The palace at Topkapı gave ambition a route and a barrier. Gates controlled approach. Courtyards separated petitioners, guards officials, and the inner household. Food was prepared on an immense scale. Records moved between offices. The ruler was both present and hidden. A man seeking favor passed through architecture before he reached a decision. The army answered the same problem in a different way. The Devshirme was a coercive levy, drawn mainly from Christian subjects in the Balkans, that supplied boys for service to the Sultan. Some were trained for the palace. Others entered the Janissary corps. The system could raise selected men to high office, but it also took children from families under imperial authority. The Janissaries changed over the centuries. Early discipline, household loyalty, firearms, wages, and barracks life made them central to Ottoman military strength. Later, recruitment practices broadened and the corps became more involved in politics and urban society. The same body that had served the ruler on campaign could press its own demands in the capital. By the early 16th century, the Ottomans were no longer simply a Balkan and Anatolian empire. Selim I turned east and south. After confronting the Safavid threat, his armies defeated the Mamluks and brought Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz into Ottoman orbit. Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Mecca, and Medina altered the empire's religious and economic weight. The conquest of the Arab provinces gave the empire older administrative worlds to manage. Damascus was a city of scholars, merchants, and pilgrimage traffic. Cairo had its own military households and legal traditions. The Hijaz could not be treated as an ordinary frontier. Caravan security, pilgrimage, and the protection of sacred places now entered imperial correspondence. Egypt mattered in grain, tax, scholarship, and prestige. The Nile Valley could feed armies and cities. Cairo carried Mamluk traditions that did not disappear overnight. The holy cities gave the Ottoman Sultan a role that reached far beyond dynastic ambition. For Istanbul, the south was no longer distant. It had become part of the empire's claim to Islamic leadership. Süleyman inherited this enlarged world and gave it a formidable political rhythm. In Europe, the victory at Mohacs in 1526 broke the old Hungarian kingdom and opened a long struggle with the Habsburgs. In the east, campaigns against the Safavids brought Baghdad into Ottoman hands. Each frontier demanded different skills: cavalry, artillery, negotiation, fortification, and patience. The Sultan's campaigns were contests of supply as much as courage. Oxen dragged guns through mud. Engineers laid bridges. Accountants calculated rations before soldiers saw the enemy. Villages in Hungary or Iraq depended on villages far behind the front, on cart wheels, fodder, river crossings, and men who could keep records when weather broke the road. At sea, Ottoman power moved through admirals, shipwrights, port officials, and corsair captains. Barbarossa's career tied North African bases to the wider contest for the Mediterranean. Ottoman fleets challenged Habsburg and Venetian interests, carried soldiers, and guarded sea roads. In a shipyard, empire meant timber, rope, biscuit, wages, and the patience to build again after loss. Diplomacy widened the field again. Ottoman rulers dealt with Venice, Habsburg emperors, Safavid shahs, and the King of France. The Franco-Ottoman relationship showed that strategic calculation could cross confessional lines. Commercial privileges helped diplomacy and trade, while Ottoman bargaining power was strong. Their meaning changed as foreign states gained leverage in later centuries. In Istanbul, this confidence took stone form. Sinan's mosque complexes rose from engineering, geometry, and patronage. The Süleymaniye gathered worship, education, charity, kitchens, and burial into one urban composition. Its courtyards, domes, and surrounding institutions made imperial order visible without needing a battlefield. A poor man might meet the dynasty through bread before he ever saw a soldier. A 16th century visitor would not have seen one uniform empire. In Sarajevo, a bridge and market drew mountain traffic into Ottoman life. In Damascus, pilgrims prepared for the long road south. In Cairo, old Mamluk households adjusted to Ottoman governors and imperial tax demands. Across North Africa, local power and loyalty to the Sultan shared the same political vocabulary. For most subjects, the empire arrived in ordinary forms. A judge heard a dispute over inheritance. A tax official checked a village register. A guild elder argued over prices. A farmer watched weather as closely as politics. Soldiers passed through a district and needed bread. The Sultan's name traveled far, but it usually reached people through local voices. The strongest Ottoman century was not the empire's absolute territorial maximum. Its greatest political confidence came earlier than some later borders. The 16th century gave it prestige, rhythm, and institutions that shaped its memory. Yet confidence brought expense. War needed money. money needed records. Records needed men trusted enough to collect what the state demanded. The pressure first appeared in uneven ways. Prices rose as silver moved through global markets. Campaigns grew longer and dearer. Firearms changed the value of older cavalry systems. Janissaries expected regular pay. Provincial officials looked for profit. The treasury needed cash where older arrangements had delivered service. By the late 16th century, petitions and complaints told their own story. In Anatolia, the Salali rebellions exposed the cost of disorder. Tax pressure, military change, local violence, and rural insecurity fed one another. Villagers abandoned fields in some districts. Officials struggled to separate banditry from rebellion and rebellion from survival. In places far from Istanbul, armed men could make the state's promises feel very thin. The palace faced its own strains. Succession remained dangerous, and methods of controlling royal princes changed over time. Court factions, senior households, religious scholars, and military corps gained influence around the throne. Some sultans ruled energetically, others depended more heavily on ministers. Decisions still emerged from the palace, but they passed through thicker human traffic. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 became a turning point because of what followed. War with a European coalition ended in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. The Ottomans accepted major territorial losses in Europe and negotiated from weakness. The frontier moved back. In the Chancery, old formulas now had to describe an altered map. The 18th century was not empty decline, it was full of adaptation. Provincial notables gained strength in the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. Some collected taxes, some raised troops, some built local households powerful enough to bargain with Istanbul. A governor's seal still mattered, but it sometimes confirmed power already made elsewhere. Reformers tried to rebuild the state without breaking it. They studied drill, artillery, schools, printing, embassies, and finance. Borrowing European methods could save Ottoman sovereignty, but it also threatened established privileges. New soldiers needed new taxes. New schools produced new expectations. In barracks, ministries, and provincial offices, reform arrived as paperwork before it became habit. Mehmed II forced one of the sharpest changes. In 1826, after Janissary resistance, the old corps was forcibly abolished. A new army followed, along with changes in dress, bureaucracy, and provincial government. The military household that had once guarded the Sultan had become an obstacle to central power. Its removal gave reformers room, not certainty. The Tanzimat reforms sought to make Ottoman rule more regular, more centralized, and more defensible. The Gülhane Edict of 1839 promised security of life, honor, and property. And the Reform Edict of 1856 pushed the language of equal subjecthood further. Councils, schools, courts, and ministries expanded. In official language, Ottoman citizenship became a political answer to imperial fracture. In a Balkan town, reform might mean new courts and conscription. In an Arab province, it might mean tighter taxation from Istanbul. For a non-Muslim merchant, it could offer opportunity and expose resentment. For a Muslim village notable, it could look like a loss of inherited authority. A conscription notice on a wall could divide a neighborhood. Foreign pressure made every argument sharper. Britain, France, Russia, and Austria watched Ottoman weakness through their own interests. Some claimed to protect Christian communities. Others wanted trade, ports, routes, or strategic depth. The Crimean War briefly placed the empire inside a European alliance, but it also tied survival to borrowing. Loans became another channel through which politics entered the treasury. By the 1870s, debt had become a political fact. The empire defaulted on obligations, then faced the aftermath of war with Russia and severe territorial loss. In 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration placed important revenues under foreign creditor control. Salt, stamps, tobacco monopolies, and other income streams were tied to repayment arrangements that limited the state's freedom. Abdülhamid II ruled in this narrowed space. He expanded schools, railways, telegraphs, and central surveillance. He used the language of Islamic legitimacy to bind Muslim subjects to the throne. He also restricted political opposition. Reports from distant provinces now moved with a speed earlier sultans could not have imagined. Population movement changed the empire's inner life. Muslims fleeing lost territories arrived in Anatolia and Istanbul, bringing hardship and anger. Christian communities in the Balkans pressed towards national independence or autonomy. Armenians sought reform and security in the eastern provinces. Arab intellectuals debated Ottoman loyalty, local autonomy, and language. The borders were not the only things being redrawn. The constitutional revolution of 1908 briefly made a different future visible. Newspapers opened, deputies gathered, crowds celebrated the return of parliamentary rule. The Committee of Union and Progress became central to politics, though not always in a simple or open way. Many hoped constitutional citizenship could rescue the state. Almost immediately, events outside the chamber narrowed that hope. The promise of equal Ottoman citizenship had to compete with wounded sovereignty and rival national programs. In parliament, deputies spoke for provinces with different fears. In the streets, new freedoms released old grievances. The empire had become more politically articulate, but not easier to hold. Public language expanded while territory contracted. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were a deep rupture. The Ottomans lost nearly all remaining European territory. Salonika, once a major Ottoman port and a center of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian life, was gone. Edirne was lost and then recovered. Refugees moved east. Officials saw maps shrink, but families felt the change as displacement, hunger, and uncertainty. The First World War placed the weakened empire under unbearable strain. Ottoman leaders sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, seeking protection, opportunity, and a way out of diplomatic isolation. The fronts stretched from the Caucasus to the Dardanelles, from Mesopotamia to Syria and Palestine. Gallipoli brought a defensive victory. Elsewhere, distance, disease, supply failure, and exhaustion wore down armies and civilians. Wartime rule also narrowed politics. The Committee of Union and Progress concentrated power, while security fears shaped decisions across the interior. Railways could not solve every shortage. Telegraphs carried urgent orders into provinces where officials lacked animals, grain, and trust. By then, many orders reached men who had already given more than the state could repay. In 1915 and 1916, the coup-led Ottoman government carried out deportations and mass killing against Armenian subjects. The catastrophe is widely recognized by scholars and many states as genocide. It was a central act of wartime state violence, ordered and administered by men who held power. Its consequences remained after the empire that carried it out had disappeared. By 1928, Ottoman endurance was spent. The Armistice of Mudros ended the empire's war and opened the way for Allied occupation. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces acted across former Ottoman lands. Istanbul itself came under occupation. The palace still existed. Its ceremonies continued. The decisions that mattered were increasingly being made elsewhere. The post-war settlement proposed at Sevres threatened to divide Anatolia as well as the Arab provinces already lost. Authority then shifted towards Ankara, where Mustafa Kemal and the nationalist movement claimed legitimacy through resistance, assembly politics, and military success. This was not a revival of the Ottoman imperial order. It was a rival answer to occupation and partition. In Istanbul, the Sultan remained visible, but visibility was not command. Allied power constrained the capital. Ministers calculated under pressure. Ankara gathered officers, deputies, local networks, and a language of national defense. The contest was therefore not simply between personalities. It was between two sources of legitimacy, one imperial and dynastic, the other national and parliamentary. That distinction mattered. The Sultan's authority rested on dynasty, palace, and an empire of provinces. Ankara''s authority rested on national sovereignty and the defense of a Turkish homeland. When the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate in 1922, it did more than remove one ruler. It severed the office that had connected conquest, law, caliphate, palace, and imperial obedience. The Ottoman house left the stage it had occupied since the frontier years. The caliphate survived briefly without the Sultanate, then was abolished in the Republic. Istanbul remained immense, but it was no longer the seat of a universal dynasty. Ankara became the capital of a new state. The old imperial headings remained in archives and on paper. Yet Ottoman rule did not disappear from the places it had shaped. In Balkan towns, bridges, mosques, baths, and market streets still mark old routes of movement and exchange. In Arab provincial cities, Ottoman barracks, clock towers, archives, and legal memories sit beside older Islamic and local traditions. In Anatolia, population movements and lost homelands became part of family history. The Waqf, the charitable endowment, left another kind of trace. It maintained fountains, schools, soup kitchens, mosques, libraries, and roads across centuries. Some buildings survived. Others lost their income, purpose, or community. An archive entry for a repair, a salary, or a loaf of bread can reveal how deeply empire once entered ordinary life. Istanbul carries the most crowded memory. The Theodosian walls still cross the landward edge of the city. Hagia Sophia has served different regimes and different sacred meanings. Ottoman mosques rise above Byzantine cisterns and modern traffic. Ferries move across waters once watched by customs officials, naval commanders, fishermen, and pilgrims. One city holds more than one past. The Ottoman Empire rose because a frontier lordship learned to hold what it took. It endured because conquest was followed by registers, courts, garrisons, roads, and negotiated obedience. It faltered when war, debt, nationalism, reform, foreign pressure, and internal mistrust pulled those habits apart. By the end, the old paperwork still existed, but the authority behind it had changed. A small principality became a Mediterranean and Middle Eastern power. Then a memory distributed across many nations. Its legacy is argued over because it touched so many lives differently. For some, it was order. For others, burden. For many, it was simply the world their ancestors knew, a judge's court, a market tax, a conscription order, a roofline, a road. The empire that took Constantinople learned that ruling was harder than conquest. Its rulers could make a Roman imperial capital, Ottoman build mosques, command fleets, and send orders across continents. But every order still needed grain, coin, trust, and men willing to obey. When those no longer met, the empire remained visible for a while in paper, stone, and ceremony. In 1922, the Sultanate was abolished by vote, not by siege.